Welcome to Voices,
a podcast from the Institute for Human Rights and Business.
Here, we're seeking to elevate the range of perspectives
on the role of business in the world
and in people's everyday lives.
Dance your anger and your joys. Dance the military funds to silence. Dance the dumb laws to the dumb. Dance oppression and injustice to death. Dance, my people, for we have seen tomorrow, and there is an Ogoni star in the sky. This was a poem. These are the words of Ken Saro-Wiwa. Ken Saro-Wiwa, Barinem Kiobel, Saturday Dobi, Paul Lebura, Nodu Iao, Felix Noate, Daniel Gaboko, John Kapunen, Baribor Bera. These were 9 people of the movement of the survival of the Ogoni people, Ogoni folks, who were falsely implicated in a charge for killing 4 Ogoni chiefs. The trial went on, and in 1995, on the 10th of November, in spite of international pressure from Commonwealth, from President Clinton at that time, Prime Minister Major at that time, the dictator at that time who ruled Nigeria, Sani Abacha, ignored them, disregarded those pleas, and they were executed. It was a hugely important moment for the understanding of business and human rights. Amnesty International, one of the world's leading human rights organizations, started a process soon after that to develop human rights principles for companies. Human Rights Watch prepared a report called The Price of Oil, that the oil price is not measured in dollars and cents, but sometimes with blood and sometimes with devastated countryside. And it also forced people to look at ways to bring about corporate accountability. Campaigning is all very well, but maybe litigation is a way forward. And the other way was for certain governments to think that this is so crucial and so critical that we have to think beyond traditional ways of bringing about accountability and looking at newer ways of looking at how we can do something to bring about corporate accountability and bringing about some kind of remedy and some justice for the victims of human rights abuses. I'm talking today with Nimmo Basi. Nimmo is not a stranger at all to the Institute for Human Rights and Business and its work. He is, of course, a winner of the Rafto Prize. He's a human rights defender and environmental activist. He is in Nigeria, and he's joining us from there to tell us a bit more about the importance of Ken Saro-Wiwa and his associates and what the whole corporate accountability movement is all about. Nimo, thank you very much for joining us. Tell us about Ken. Who was he and why does he matter?
Thank you so much, Salil. Ken Saro-Wiwa is a central figure in environmental justice movement, not just in Nigeria, but across Africa. He was a writer, a playwright, a poet, a politician, and a businessman. You could imagine all this rolled into one person. His role in elevating the struggle for environmental justice for the Ogoni people is so central, as well as elevating the cultural rights as minorities in Nigeria. These were the 2 things he was looking at: environmental justice, control of Ogoni resources in Ogoni land, as well as basic respect and dignity for the Ogoni people. And he did this very selflessly. He invested his resources, his time, his creativity, and almost most of his writings were towards this goal: to elevate the dignity of the people, to demand for environmental justice, and also basic human rights. And many of his writings kind of, I would say, spoke about how he would end up himself. There's a short story he wrote called Africa Kills Her Son, S-U-N. And, kind of people who were fighting for, characters who were fighting for justice, for basic dignity, for the rights of the people, people who were very selfless, were not so much concerned with their own personal well-being, so to speak. And then at the end, they were executed just like he was. Now, Ken Saro-Wiwa was a leader of the movement for the survival for Ogoni people, Mossop, M-O-S-O-P. And he was one of the architects of the Ogoni Bill of Rights. The Ogoni Bill of Rights is the charter of demands that the Ogoni people prepared and sent to the Nigerian military government in 1990, asking for, stating out the demands they were making from the Nigerian state. And that document inspired other ethnic nationalities in Niger Delta to also produce their charters of demand. For example, we had the Oron Bill of Rights, we had the Kayama Declaration of Ijaw Young People, and we had the Orobo Economic Summit demands, and many other demands like of that nature. So he was an intellectual activist. He believed he was a man of peace. He called himself a man of peace, and that's what he was. In fact, in the mobilization of Ogoni people that led to the expulsion of Shell from Ogoni land in 1993, he said that Ogoni people will fight peacefully and they will stay resolute, non-violently, not one drop of blood will be shed, and they would win. But unfortunately, the state framed him and 8 other Ogoni leaders. They were accused of, 9 or other Ogoni leaders. They were accused of killing 4 Ogoni chiefs that many of us believe they were not killed by, of course, they were not killed by Saro, Wiwa and the Ogoni leaders. They were murdered to trigger this kind of repression across Ogoni land. And so it was made, here his colleagues were made to face a military tribunal, a kangaroo court, and the court eventually passed a death sentence on 9 of them, including Kensawiwa and 8 other leaders. And the funny thing is that kind of judgment, the tribunal by military law provided a period of time for those who were condemned to death to make an appeal. And within the period, and during this time, they were to be given the judgment and all the writings from the court so that they could defend themselves. But before any of this could be done, they were hung by the Nigerian state, which was very, very sad in the face of international appeals and condemnations. It was at the time the Commonwealth was meeting, I think, in Australia. And at that same time, while Mandela and the rest were making appeals, the Nigerian military got him executed. So this memorial, the 25th memorial, we are careful not to call it anniversary because anniversary has a sense of celebration, but this is a thing of pain. The key thing for us is that we don't just want to remember 25 years. We want the Nigerian state to declare, to exonerate him and the other Ogoni leaders who were executed for no reason whatsoever.
That is a very, very important point because, you cannot really move on from the past without acknowledging the wrong that was done. So that's a very fair point. But Nigeria is right now undergoing a lot of pressure politically, and there have been political controversy going on, riots going on. Are you optimistic? If Ken were here with us today, what would he be doing?
If he had been here with us, he would have been a 79-year-old man. He would have been a man of more wisdom than he had in those days. And so his home would have been a place of pilgrimage for activists and for everybody because he was everybody's man. I believe that if he were around today, he would still be making the same demands he made 25 years ago because things have not shifted. The only thing that has shifted over the years is that in 2011, the United Nations Environment Program issued a report on the assessment of Ogoni environment, and that report completely validated everything that
vindicated all his work.
Yeah, all the pollution. And in fact, some of the key highlights of that report is that in some places in Ogoniland, they have the groundwater with benzene 900 times above World Health Organization standard. They also said that in some places in Ogoniland, the hydrocarbons as crude oil has sunk up to a depth of 5 meters. That is incredible. But recently when I visited, because the kind of cleanup has kind of commenced, a process has commenced to clean up Ogoniland. I went to one of the lots where they had excavated and treated the soil, and the pollution between 2011 and this year had gone down to 10 meters, which is really scary, which means the more pollution is allowed to fester, the more the contamination gets
Mhm.
entrenched. Yeah, so the things are still, Ogoni people are still demanding that the oil wells in Ogoni territory should not be reopened. At least the place has to be cleaned up, and the UNEP has said it will take at least 30 years to clean up and remediate and restore the environment. So for anybody to think of reopening the oil wells now, it's like opening the tap and then trying to dry the floor at the same time. It doesn't work that way.
And how have the companies behaved? Has the situation changed? Have they learned from the past? Do you see improved practices? Because what we do see is that there have been several initiatives since then, and we will be talking about it in the course with in other panels as we go along. But I was just curious: do you think that their corporate practices have changed in terms of consultation, in terms of cleaner practices?
Um, well, you're asking the wrong man this question.
Ah, you're the right man for me.
Yeah, okay, all right, thank you. Because I actually don't believe that oil corporations operating in Nigeria can ever do anything right. They have been very influential over the laws. Most of the laws governing the activity was drawn up during the Nigerian Civil War, which was in the late 1960s. And those laws were drawn up for operations in a conquered territory. And so the people were not consulted, the environment was not considered. And so the oil companies are busy running on that same platform. Recently, a few weeks, currently, there's a petroleum industry bill which has been in the works for over a decade. A new version has been sent to the National Assembly and they're considering it. And one key thing is about how oil companies relate to the communities. What that bill specifies is that the oil companies have to carry out some corporate social responsibility activities with the communities, with host communities, and the question of who is the host community is to be determined by the oil companies, and I think this is a booby trap, because if the oil companies are the ones who determine who is the host community, then the divide and rule would persist in the region. Because we all know that the fact that an oil well is located where my laptop is now doesn't mean that the oil is sitting right under my laptop. There's a horizontal drilling. You can put the oil rig somewhere and drill the oil from somewhere else. And then using the rig location as the host community, we kind of not consider those other places where the resource may actually be coming from. And always, my position is that host communities are both those who host the oil companies and those who host the pollution. There's an example of a community in Ogoniland called Goi. Goi had a massive, was affected a massive oil spill in 2004, 2005, and a fire that accompanied it. And actually, most of the people of Goi community in Ogoni are now refugees in other locations because their village was burned down. They don't have an oil well, they don't have any pipeline passing there, they don't have a flow station, nothing, no oil company presence, but they have a creek system that goes to tidal flow. So pollution somewhere else is brought by the creek to this community. And so definition of who the community is should never be left to the oil companies. It's something that government should define. And I believe civil society are making that demand as the bill is being considered. And so now, the only thing something that has changed, I would say, over the years, is that oil companies are quicker now to acknowledge when an oil spill occurs. And that could also be because Nigeria has an agency called the National Oil Spills Detection and Response Agency, which always tries to put their eyes on the ground to announce when there's an oil spill. So there's a quicker response in terms of acknowledging the spill, not in terms of cleanup. I don't think there's any good cleanup going on anywhere in areas where new oil spills are occurring. And this national agency informed that in 2018 and 2019, Nigeria had 1,300 oil spills, coming down to about 5 oil spills a day. Now, that is extremely scandalous. It shows that oil spill is a routine thing in the Niger Delta, although the corporations claim that most of them are caused by third-party interferences or also by sabotage. But the claim of sabotage is what was in the laws. When the oil companies can say this is sabotage, then they are not responsible in terms of compensation for the harm done and in some other ways to respond to it. So they hide behind that to keep claiming sabotage. But I do think that the oil companies have also won a big communications war or coup, we may call it, because really they've been very, very strong at having journalists focus on the pollution caused by third-party interferences. And so whenever you talk about oil spills these days, the imagination of most people is that this is caused by community people. But if you consider how much oil is being stolen and unaccounted for the Niger Delta, you find that the spills and the theft is going on at industrial scale. This cannot be done by poor community people. It's done by people with industry knowledge, people who can have security cover, people who have political cover. And so it's a massive thing going on. And we're talking about different figures that are so enormous that many countries don't produce as much as that. And there's no correct metering of the oil fields. So one cannot really say how much is precisely extracted, how much is exported, and what is coming to the state. So we're running in a system where the bottom of the bucket is more or less out. So the demands of Ken Saro-Wiwa and his colleagues who started campaign for environmental justice is still as valid today as it was many years ago.
It's very sobering what you just said, and chastening, and it just shows that the work is not complete, not done. The struggle will go on. And the only thing I can say is that, it's wonderful that there are people like you who are focusing on the tasks ahead and continuing to remind Nigeria that economic progress is not measured only in terms of barrels of oil and GDP, but on the way the people in the Delta live, the way the people throughout the country live. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot.
I have a very distinguished panel today with me. They are all people who had known of Ken's work, who have been working on business and human rights for many years, and who have felt strongly about it. They have been with this struggle for a long time, and they've also been working towards corporate accountability. Over the next hour, what we will be doing is talking about what happened then, what was the impact that followed, and what can we learn from that, and how much remains to be done. The friends I'm going to be speaking with are Paul Hoffman, who led not just the Wiwa versus Shell case, but he was also involved with the Kyobel case at the US Supreme Court, which looked at the Alien Tort Statute and what that does for corporate accountability. We are very fortunate also to have Bronwyn Manbay joining us. Bronwyn was one of the principal authors of the report, The Price of Oil, which focused global attention on business and human rights, and talk about what happened there and what was the view from abroad and how did the international human rights community react to it. And we have Bennett Freeman. Bennett Freeman was at that time a senior official at the US State Department. And he thought, wouldn't it be nice that when there are governments which are unwilling or unable to do what they ought to do for protect human rights, wouldn't it be nice if some governments where these companies are headquartered, some of the companies which want to change and turn a new corner, and some human rights NGOs come together and create a mechanism that leads us towards some kind of justice. We'll have a broad-ranging discussion, and I want to keep it in a conversational tone, so there are no opening remarks as such, but just as a leading way to start, I thought I'll start with you, Bronwyn. Okay. You wrote the report, and what led you to it? I mean, traditionally, human rights organizations, as we know, look at the state as the party, which has all the obligations, which is legally true. But this was a unique situation, and focusing on Nigeria and focusing on oil became crucial. So your thoughts on both what led you to do it and your thoughts on what Ken Saro-Wiwa meant?
So at the time Ken Saro-Wiwa was executed, I was actually working for Lawyers for Human Rights in South Africa. I had a connection to Human Rights Watch already. And I should give credit to my predecessor who wrote about the Ogoni crisis, Melissa Crow. And the first connection I had with the Saro-Wiwa case was Lawyers of Human Rights facilitated advocacy with the South African government by some visiting Nigerian human rights activists. So during the period of the Commonwealth Summit, when the Commonwealth heads of state protested, Mandela famously attacked Abacha for the execution. I mean, nobody could quite believe that the death penalty had been pronounced, but nobody could actually believe they were really going to be executed. And so my first awareness really of Ken Saro-Wiwa, I mean, obviously I followed the news, but my first direct engagement was around that process of trying to get the new South African government to take some action and to put pressure on the Nigerian government in the Commonwealth Summit and elsewhere. I rejoined Human Rights Watch the following year, towards the end of the following year, and started work on Nigeria. it was a period of military dictatorship, so I was working on general military issues. But the situation in the Niger Delta remained, of course, completely critical. There were new people coming up, organizing, trying to challenge the oil companies. So even though the Ogoni crisis, it wasn't like the crisis was over, but it was quieter because of the devastation of the leadership had been taken out. It was really, but the organization had been severely weakened. But other parts of the Niger Delta began to organize as well. And I spent, it was logical to pick up on the work and to think about it. And I think that, I mean, what Saro Wiwa did was make that almost inevitable. That, the amount of focus on his activism, on his execution, meant that the eyes of the world had been pulled to the Niger Delta and what actually was going on. So writing further about the Niger Delta was, something that had to be done. How it turned into a large report called The Price of Oil, looking much more broadly at the issues around environment and economic and social rights and so forth, was an interesting process of discussion. And I think, so the way, if you are a human rights nerd, you can pass that report and see which sections. So there were some parts of the report that I wrote as being the substantive part of the report that became background, for example, because for Human Rights Watch to write a report that directly challenged the oil companies and directly talked about environmental pollution was a very new step for us at the time. It was the first report that Human Rights Watch did actually engage directly in looking at the responsibility of corporations. And so there was a really, I mean, my first draft went to the legal office who said, I don't think we can publish this. We can't say this stuff. It's not our mandate as Human Rights Watch. We need to look at what the state is doing. And how do we talk about corporations? So there was a long period of discussion about how to do that. And in the context of Nigeria, I think there are two good reasons for doing that. One is the oil companies are directly responsible for a lot of bad things that go on the Niger Delta. And the other part is that while, if you were in the context of a military government, in Nigeria, the military government had demonstrated itself to be completely impervious to international public opinion by indeed executing Ken Saro-Wiwa. And the oil companies at least were a mechanism of leverage to try to address some questions in the context of a government that was completely impossible to reach in other ways. And so I think that was the reasoning behind it. The purpose as well was to create a narrative about why this is a human rights problem, why it's not just environment, why it's not just economics, why it's not just development, why is this a human rights problem? And that was really the objective of the report.
No, what you said, Bronwyn, resonates because I was a researcher at Amnesty International a little later, but 1999 is when I started there. And same kind of questions, because when we were, after my first visit to the Niger Delta and when we wrote the report, some of the legal colleagues quite genuinely raised the question exactly on the same line that these are the responsibility of the Nigerian state, and why are we calling on the company to do this? Aren't we giving a free pass to the state? And Paul, you will recall some of those conversations because you were the chair of the International Executive Council of Amnesty at that time, and which is how we first met about 20-something years ago. And I was just curious about what led you, as somebody who felt strongly about the case, actually to think in terms of litigation as a way to bring about change in this context. And if you can also explain, because we have viewers from around the world, what is the Alien Tort Statute? I mean, how can a company which is a Dutch-British company doing something in Nigeria, why should the US court be worried about it?
Well, I mean, the Alien Tort Statute is a law that was passed in 1789 as part of the first statute that was passed by the US Congress. And it gave non-citizens the ability to bring cases in the newly created federal courts for torts committed in violation of the law of nations. And there are very few cases in the beginning. And so the actual meaning of the statute has been shrouded in some mystery and some debate. But in 1980, the Center for Constitutional Rights brought a landmark case against a torturer from Paraguay who was found living in Brooklyn, a case called Filartiga. And the courts found that the statute did apply in US courts in the modern times, and that if you had a non-citizen, a plaintiff, that found the perpetrator of a human rights violation, a violation of the law of nations, in the United States at least, that they could bring a claim against them. And for the period from, I would say, 1980 to the mid 1990s, a lot of the cases that we brought were brought against people like Ferdinand Marcos, torturers that were found living in Georgia. There were cases around the country where we were pretty successful in getting courts to apply the statute when perpetrators were found in the United States, and their victims could bring cases against them. In the mid 1990s, we decided, and this sort of coincided with the debates that were going on in Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and other human rights organizations, that corporations had an enormous amount of power, and were often complicit in human rights violations committed by governments, and sometimes were committing them or aiding and abetting them themselves. And so one of the first big cases was a case called Doe versus Unical, which was filed in the mid 1990s. And that had to do with torture and summary execution and forced labor on a pipeline project in Burma. And that suit ultimately was successful in the sense that there was a settlement in the mid 2000s. And the execution of the Agoni 9 coincided with that decision to bring cases against corporations and to try to use the Alien Tort Statute as a mechanism of corporate accountability. And I think that the Wiwa case had a certain power, particularly within the US legal system and the US political legal culture, that a lot of the other cases didn't have, because the story was so powerful, that Ken Saro-Wiwa's legacy was so strong. And it goes to your question of how could US courts assert jurisdiction. Well, you know, we got jurisdiction over the parent companies of Shell because there was an investor office in New York. I'm not sure we would be able to do that anymore, and originally the case was dismissed for lack of personal jurisdiction and for an argument that the cases should have been brought either in Holland or in the UK. But the Second Circuit reversed that. And I think part of the reason they reversed it was the story of Ken Saro-Wiwa, the facts. In a lot of these cases, the facts wind up convincing judges, they convince people that support the litigation. And I think that the Wiwa litigation always was strong because of the narrative, because of what happened. That got us through discovery battles. It got us through, you know, the various motions that Shell brought to dismiss the case, which they did all the time. They tried to bury us in paper. And ultimately, the case was settled in 2009 after 14 years. And I think one of the reasons Shell wound up settling actually was there was a Ken Saro-Wiwa Jr. was a leader in the litigation. I think he was able to convey the power of his father's legacy in ways that probably very few other people could. Even Owens Wiwa was Ken Saro-Wiwa's brother, was a plaintiff. He did the same, but Ken Saro-Wiwa Jr. had a certain charisma that I think his father had too. And I remember the New York Times doing a major piece right before we were scheduled to go to trial. And it was after that piece and after Ken Saro-Wiwa's interviews, Ken Saro-Wiwa Jr.'s interviews, that Shell started to talk about settlement and tried to reach an agreement with us. Because I think they were afraid of a trial that would have laid out their complicity with the Nigerian government in bringing about the execution. And so, it was I think, a very powerful case. It's one of the few cases that did reach a settlement, and a settlement that included a fund for people other than the plaintiffs in the case. Ken Saro-Wiwa Jr., I think, in a lot of our discussions about whether to settle or whether to go through with trial, Ken Saro-Wiwa Jr. talked a lot about his father's legacy and about what a settlement might mean, and about the fact that the struggle's never over, right? I mean, I'm about to argue the latest in this series of cases, Doe versus Nestle, in the Supreme Court on December 1st, where right around the same time, well, actually, I guess it was 2005, right about that time, we brought this case against the chocolate companies for their complicity in child slavery in Ivory Coast, another problem that seems to be impossible to solve. And we're going up against the chocolate companies in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court's not a particularly favorable place. But what I take from Ken Saro-Wiwa's legacy, where you started in terms of the most admonitions, is that we're not going to stop. I mean, if they take away the Alien Tort Statute, then there'll be other ways to do it. We have cases where they've taken away the Alien Tort Statute, and we brought claims based on foreign law. For example, in Doe versus Exxon, our case is based on Indonesian law. In a case called Doe versus Chiquita about mass murder in the banana growing fields in Colombia, it's based on Colombian law. And so the movement that started with these cases, in which Ken Saro-Wiwa's legacy and memory played such a major role, won't stop, right? And so I think that's the lesson that I take from it. And I think one of the things I do in my classes when I teach young lawyers about what they should be doing, I talk about Ken Saro-Wiwa, and a lot of them were born since Ken Saro-Wiwa's execution. But that story still has power. And I think it helps inspire young lawyers that are interested in doing this kind of work to keep doing it, notwithstanding the obstacles and the difficulties and the challenges that we face.
Thank you, Paul. And Bennett, you heard both Bronwyn and Paul laying out the limitations. And you are in a government. You want to see the potential of what can be done. And the president at the time tries to influence the other government, and it does not make any difference. And you want to step in, and you want to see how one can create a mechanism, some way of moving forward so that we have corporate accountability. Walk us through that story, because it's very inspiring.
No, thank you, Salil. And the power of the story is, as Paul just put it, cannot be understated. The tragedy of Ken Saro-Wiwa, the Ogoni 9 on November 10, 1995 was, of course, first and foremost a tragedy for those families, for the Ogoni people, for all of Nigeria. But the story itself became a thunderclap around the world, a lightning bolt across not just the oil industry, but business, multinational corporations around the world. And I was personally thunderstruck. I was at the time in a very different role at the U.S. Department of State, where I had no direct connection to these issues. I was the chief speechwriter for the Secretary of State, the foreign minister. But put in the back of my mind that at some point I wanted to get involved in these issues. But I then had another role in 1997 and 8 that is going to sound like a convoluted path, but it was actually one that led me directly to these issues beginning in early 1999 when I met you, Salil, as well as Bronwyn. And that is, I was the deputy to the Undersecretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs, Stuart Eisenstadt, who led an extraordinary diplomatic effort to hold to account the Swiss banks, German industrial companies, and others for the hidden dimensions of the Holocaust, slave labor, the confiscation of assets of Jews. And I spent day and night for 2 years, as his deputy, directing both the historical research and the international diplomacy. And the point there is that it was an extraordinary effort, and not just the U.S. government. We led it, but a couple dozen other governments were involved in establishing a principle we hoped, not just a legal, but a political and moral precedent for at least retrospective corporate accountability, in this case for the Holocaust, related to financial and economic losses. And so coming out of that role in early 1999 and then becoming the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for what we call democracy, human rights, and labor at the State Department, and being in charge of our bilateral human rights diplomacy around the world, I was very motivated to try to do something related to corporate responsibility. And frankly, it was not a long process of consideration to land very quickly on the oil and mining industries, conflict zones, security forces, gross corruption, terrible governance. And it was an instant step to the Niger Delta, Indonesia, Colombia, and a number of other countries around the world. And I was aware of the litigation. I hadn't met Paul. I didn't meet him until some years later, but aware of the litigation at the time, and made aware by you, Salil, when we first met. I think in the spring of 1999, of the work of Amnesty in developing some very early human rights principles for companies, aware of the pioneering work of the Amnesty UK section, Business and Human Rights Group, founded by the late great Sir Geoffrey Chandler, and then had the chance to meet Bronwyn. And by the time I met Bronwyn, and I think you, Salil, for the first time in London in June of 1999, I'd already formulated a broad initiative to use the convening power of the US government to try to bring together NGOs at the time, North country-based international NGOs, principally Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, but a number of others, including International Alert, together with the major US and UK oil and mining companies, and together in cooperation with the UK Foreign Office. And it was essential to try to do this on a transatlantic, if not global basis. And I can't emphasize enough how important the London connection was, because you, Salil, were starting to do this work on behalf of Amnesty, Bronwyn on behalf of Human Rights Watch, together with her American colleague, Arvind Ganeshan, based in Washington, who became a close partner of mine. But also BP and Shell were beginning to wrestle with these issues, particularly around security forces. And so there was a partly open door already to then deploy the convening power and diplomatic skill of the State Department. It was a huge process, and it was an instant recognition, frankly, on my part, that it would not be possible to pursue in the short to medium term of several years a legislative or regulatory route. As much as I believe in legally binding standards and felt that way at the time, but that we needed to try to create some kind of a multi-stakeholder process, a phrase hardly used at the time, that could at least start by developing a joint standard that could have some global impact. And the only precedents at the time were the two related initiatives that are both very much alive and well a couple decades later, both focused on labor rights in the apparel sector, principally the Ethical Trading Initiative, founded in London, and the Fair Labor Association, founded in Washington. So those were some models that I was able to work with, at least be aware of. But we put what became the voluntary principles on security and human rights together in calendar year 2000, after a tremendous amount of consultations and learnings on my part and others in 1999. I can't emphasize enough how challenging it was initially to engage the US oil companies, even more challenging the US mining companies. And not that Shell and BP were a piece of cake then or now, but on a comparative basis, it was really important to get them together in the room with the U.S. oil companies in particular. So the voluntary principles were done and announced by Madeleine Albright and Robin Cook, the late Foreign Secretary of the UK, in December of 2000, and are marking their 20th anniversary in just a month now, and are still at it. And so I can't emphasize also enough my own view at the time and ever since that multi-stakeholder initiatives, voluntary standards are an important piece of the overall architecture, but only a piece. The other key pillars, of course, are litigation, where Paul has been a global leader, NGO research and campaigning, not least on the part of Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and many, many others. And above all, of course, civil society, local communities in Nigeria and around the world. But also over the years, responsible investors, others who have gotten into the act from a financial perspective. And we now have, of course, a much broader architecture. But I would say that that this tragedy of November 10, 1995 was absolutely the founding forcing event that captured the attention and the imagination, as tragic as it was, of a number of us around the world to do what we could. And it's so sobering to hear Nimmo's assessment of the bleak situation. And we can have no illusions of that, but I do think that we can take some hope that it was this event more than any other in the last quarter century in the whole world, that put human rights inescapably, irreversibly on the agenda for business around the world. And it just absolutely crystallized some of the initial issues, galvanized action, which remains incomplete and inconsistent. But we have got the elements of the architecture, and now we've got to use all the tools I should have mentioned already. And just in a quick aside, the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, EITI, which also came partly out of this whole experience in Nigeria, trying to deal with revenue transparency and corruption. And of course, that was one of the critical dimensions of Bronwyn's very influential report for Human Rights Watch, The Price of Oil. So I think we've come to understand the multiple dimensions of human rights issues. Yes, human rights violations, security forces, but the depths of poor governance, corruption, environmental degradation. And what we learned and saw on that horrible day, November 10, 1995, what we've learned and tried to do ever since, I think leaves a legacy of understanding and trying to commit ourselves to dealing with human rights in this very broad and deep way, using every approach, every tool we can in a complementary fashion.
Thank you, Bernard. That's a very, very good summary of what led you to this and where we are now. Bronwyn, looking back at not just the report, but what's happening now in the Niger Delta, and I know you're not, I appreciate you're not directly connected with it, but you did say in the lead up to our meeting that, it had a huge impact on who you are today. So what have we achieved? And by we, I mean collectively. I'm not talking about human rights researchers and activists, but what has the world achieved? I mean, would something like this happen again? I mean, or are we now a better place, or are we in a worse situation?
Well, things like this can always happen again. One's never won a fight like this. I think, looking back over 25 years, and it was, the Niger Delta, I haven't been there for some years, and I regret that because it did, lodged itself in my heart in terms of the situation there, the causes there, and the extent to which I think, oil industry in particular, we all have to say, well, we're all responsible for this. It's actually in a way easy to say it's the oil companies or whatever. We all drive cars and heat our houses and take flights and so forth. So that's one of the complications about the oil industry, is that you have to take some personal responsibility as well about how you think about the questions. And I think that, having heard Nimmo's discussion about the current situation. I think it's perfectly clear that the situation in the Delta has not improved greatly in many respects. The oil pollution, I mean, there are some massive spills, not only in Ogoniland, but several others around the Delta that remain hugely damaging for the people living close to them. The impact of the oil industry in general is enormous, and that's not just direct oil pollution, but also disturbance of water channels, water drainage and those types of things as well. There are a lot of less obvious ways in which the oil industry has been damaging, including the damage done by massive amounts of money sloshing about with very little accountability, and the competition and violence that generates around getting a hold of those resources. So I wouldn't want to, I want to recognize all of that, but then park it and say, right, but we have had some achievements. And I think that, the Saro Wiwa case was a turning point in terms of the international discussion about the responsibilities of business and human rights. And we've moved from the principles of security and human rights into the discussion that led ultimately to the guiding principles on business and human rights, voluntary principles for the companies. And we are now talking about a treaty, which, since it would be a treaty, would be binding on states, but nonetheless creates some obligations on states to regulate the companies more effectively. And I think that normative shift in the context of an international law regime, which has historically said that states are sovereign and only states are the subject of international law, is a big normative shift. The question is, of course, is that enough to really make a difference? And I think we're not sure yet. Are we discussing micro improvements and not making a difference to the macro problem? I hope that we're addressing the macro problem, but I by no means think that we've addressed it yet. But I want to, looking back, for this 25-year anniversary, the mobilization that Ken Saro Wiwa led of the Ogoni people to bring their attention to the world is the starting point. I mean, of course, there was the anti-apartheid movement. It's not like there were not other efforts to try and look at the responsibility of business for human rights, but this was an absolutely key moment, and especially around the particular responsibilities of extractive industries.
Absolutely. And I often say when I talk to people about business and human rights that there are certain things which are necessary, but they are not necessarily sufficient. I mean, and I think that's what we need to know, that all these efforts are crucial. And I'm so glad you brought up the issue of the treaty, because I was going to raise that issue. And Paul, you have a long experience of international law building and, the importance of international law, which of course, not everybody in the US system likes the idea of international standards and so on. And it's a long struggle you fought for a very long time. But I was just curious about it, that do you think there is need for a treaty? Probably the answer is yes. What should be its scope? What can be done? And how do we move forward with that?
Well, I think there's a need for a treaty. Whether that's feasible in the short term, I don't know. In thinking about the progress, I mean, it seems to me that certainly when I started in this enterprise 40 years ago, I thought it would be possible to make more progress in that 40-year period. The thing I'm encouraged by is that I think that we have made a lot of progress in terms of making people think about the need for these norms to apply, the need for corporations to behave in ways that are not unrestrained, and where they have to compensate people and they need to behave in a better way. And I think that certainly in my dealings with corporations, I have seen that. For example, I've been involved in at least a couple of cases where we have settled and gotten relief for people where the corporations have insisted that they don't want that to be publicly known. They don't want the fact that there's a settlement to be publicly known, but they would like to do the right thing. Mm-hmm. Now, I think that's progress, right? I mean, and it's halting, and sometimes it goes the other way. I think that in a lot of corporations, there are people that want to do the right thing and people that want to take a hard line, right? And the hardliners often win. Sometimes they don't. I take heart in the students that I talk to and the generations coming up who seem to accept the principles that we've fought for, right? That's their starting point. And they're thinking about new ways to organize, new ways to reach out to the people that have power in international society to make them change their ways on these issues, on climate justice, on other kinds of issues. And I think that there, my daughter is one of those people. And when I talk to her, I get a lot of, I'm optimistic that her generation will do better than ours did. They'll take it a step further. And I think, I think of this enterprise as a 100-year enterprise, not a 40-year enterprise. And so that's hard when you're in the middle of the beginning of it. You don't get to see the end. But I do think that I'm optimistic that we will get there, right? That there will be a system that is based on human rights more than it is now. But I think it's going to be slow, and I think we're going to have setbacks. And I see that in almost every area that I work in civil rights. I mean, police reform, there are always 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And I think that's just the way that it is, right? In the human experience. But I do think that all the work that we've done has been important. I think that it's set the stage for the next advances that the next generation will do. And I think that one of the lessons that I hope that everybody takes about this is that you just have to keep at it. Right? And I think that is Ken Saro-Wiwa's legacy, right? I mean, you just got to keep finding ways to do it. If you've blocked in one way, you find another way to keep moving forward. And that's what I think people who are doing this kind of litigation, we understand that we're going to lose sometimes. We do a fair amount, but we win sometimes. And every one of those victories is another building block for the future. And I think that's how you have to look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's that's sobering and inspiring at the same time of how we look at the situation. Now, all 4 of us have, in our own ways, tried to move things forward step by step. But the people who are at the front line are the defenders, the human rights defenders. Ken Saro-Wiwa was a distinguished example of that, but there are many others we know. And 5 years ago, we did a report which was actually launched by Maria Saro-Wiwa, Ken's wife, in London, on the defenders and how they have to, how the situation hasn't changed much. And the space has been shrinking for the defenders. The global politics is also acting in a particular way. Bennett, I know you worked a lot and thought very deeply about it, and you also feel companies have a role there. What would you say to that? Where should one look at for hope?
Sure. So, we can never make progress unless we're realistic. And again, Nemo has injected a dose of reality here. But we'll never make progress unless we're optimistic and committed. And one of the grounds for optimism the last several years is exactly this challenge of recognizing the plight of human rights defenders around the world and the broader pressure that civil society and civic freedoms have come under, not only in autocratic states, but sadly in democracies that have become increasingly illiberal. But there's been a very vibrant discussion and a tremendous amount of work the last several years. And the Institute for Human Rights and Business report 5 years ago was one of the key contributions to this agenda. I spent much of my time the last several years working with the Business Human Rights Resource Center, International Service for Human Rights, to produce a whole framework for companies to think about whether, and if so, how to engage in situations related to civic freedoms, but very specifically to intervene on behalf of human rights defenders. And the work was absolutely directly inspired by what Shell did not do and the consequences of that failure to act, leading to the tragedy of November 10, 1995, but combined with the pressure on defenders and civil society globally over the last decade. And I think it's reasonable now to observe that the whole discussion around business and human rights defenders, and more broadly, the role of corporate activism and advocacy, has moved way up the agenda of the global business and human rights community. And it's never been more vital. And it all goes back to what happened and what didn't happen on November 10, 1995. So I have some optimism, particularly as I think not so much about, the reports, Salil, you and I produced, and other work that has brought this challenge back to the forefront. But I'm inspired by some of the actions that have been taken by companies, some that are known publicly, others that have not been disclosed publicly, given some of the sensitivities with home country, really host country governments. And they're inconsistent. There aren't enough of them, but we are seeing in the last couple of years more companies willing to protect defenders in specific situations, and especially more companies speaking out on human rights and civic freedoms, whether it's LGBTQ rights or it's immigrants in the U.S. and so forth. But look, the progress is halting, it's limited, the actions are inconsistent, and what we really need is a much stronger architecture of law, regulation, litigation, in addition to these advocacy efforts by companies. And I think that as states continue to largely more or less fail in their duty to protect human rights, there's going to be even more pressure. There is more pressure on the corporate responsibility to respect human rights. And that's a pallid verb, respect human rights. Companies need to be protecting human rights, even if the guiding principles won't be using that exact verb for some years to come. But that can be the legacy of November 10, 1995, is that there's a corporate responsibility to respect, but also to protect human rights.
Absolutely. And just for those of us who are not human rights nerds, to use the phrase that Bronwyn, you used quite rightly, because we will be having viewers from various parts of the world with various understanding and various levels of interest. This is purely a human rights law terminology: respect, protect, and fulfill, and that do no harm and ensure others don't harm, and so on. And of course, companies should do the right thing inevitably, and which is something that always worth bearing in mind. I am conscious of time, so I'm going to give each of you probably a minute each for some final word before I make my concluding remarks. Bronwyn, let me start with you.
So I think a very key difference that's happened over the last 25 years, that it's no longer for companies simply to say, no, we can't get involved in that, it's too political. Because I think there is a recognition that, at least if you are a large extractive industry company, these are huge transnational corporations, not doing anything is just as much of a political choice as doing something. It's saying that you think it's absolutely fine what is going on. And of course, companies intervene all the time in relation to things like the tax rates that apply to themselves, which are also very political decisions. And I think, looking back at the legacy of Saro Wiwa, that the shift, I mean, of course, many other people, but one of the things was, no, there has to be some responsibility here. Faced with a situation like this, there has to be some responsibility. The other thing I would say is that, I mean, directly in Nigeria, Ken Saro-Wiwa inspired a whole generation of leaders, of local leaders, people organizing, trying to improve the situation in the Niger Delta. Some of whom got diverted into their own money-making and less salubrious exercises, but nonetheless a cohort who are absolutely committed to the issues. He inspired a generation in Nigeria, and I know for a fact he inspired a generation across Africa as well. There were, the work that he did was so important and remains. And I think I mean, thank you for inviting me and thank you for organizing this, because I think his name deserves to be brought to the top again to say this is an ongoing struggle which we need to carry on engaging in.
And thank you for mentioning the Nigerian movement that is spawned, because I do want those of us who are watching this to know that we have another panel called View from the Ground with Nigerian voices. So it is not something, and we have to listen and learn from them. And it's not that we from outside have some kind of a magic formula for them. I approach this with that humility. I just wanted to be, and all of us, I'm sure all of you share that view. Paul, final words from you.
But I also thank you for inviting me for this. I think that I have used the Ken Saro-Wiwa case in my teaching for many years. And I think it's a story that is very inspirational to the next generation that's going to take up this torch, right? And so I think that this is very important to remember. But I think that I think people are remembering what he brought to this on a regular basis. I know many of my colleagues that were involved in the case use his legacy for teaching purposes also, and it has a power. And I think the most important power is not giving up, right? And I think that's really what his memory should be. Remember, and I think also to remember, unfortunately, Ken Saro-Wiwa Jr., who also passed and who was a major force to carry his father's legacy forward. But I think other members of the family continue to do that. And I think that's also very important. I've met other members of the family over the years during the litigation, and they're very inspirational family. And I certainly, thinking about being on this panel made me think back to the story, to what happened, to what he did, what he accomplished. The idea that half the population of Ogoni came out to that rally in the beginning. I mean, it's pretty amazing, right? And so it's a really important story to bring forth to every generation from now on.
Thank you, Paul and Bennett.
I couldn't agree more with what Paul just said, as well as with Bronwyn's comments. I mean, this happens in history on many occasions where a tragedy is just absolutely shocking, but then becomes a galvanizing event. And that was certainly the case here. It cannot understate the inspiration that came from this tragedy for so many in Ogoni land and the Niger Delta, around Nigeria, around Africa, and around the world, and the commitments that it spawned in all of us. I've felt privileged as a white American guy who at the time had a chance, as an American diplomat, to work with others, and I think that we all are very conscious that it's with the communities on the ground, with the defenders, with the rights holders, where the struggle is most important. But this is a reminder 25 years on that we all have to can do our parts wherever we sit, wherever we are around the world. It takes multiple actors, multiple tools, and I think that we've come a long, long way in these 25 years, not nearly enough, hardly anywhere in the Delta, tragically, but hopefully around the world. And it was this event, more than any other, that caught our attention and lit the path.
Thank you, Bennett. Bronwyn, the key message I took from you here is that there is complicity in silence, which is something that, Nick Howen and David Petrasek and fine people like that used to tell us about. And I think it's something worth remembering. Paul, the fact that we should never give up. I think that's a very important message that I get out of what you're saying, that, it is a long, long struggle. And Bennett, the fact that, we have to work together to get where we need to. And of course, by listening to the people on the ground. I grew up in India, so I like to quote Gandhi whenever I get a chance. So I'm going to say something by him, but I'm going to end with Wole Soyinka. Gandhi said that when I despair, I remember that all through history, the way of truth and love have always won. There have been tyrants and murderers, and for a time they can seem invincible, but in the end, they always fall. Think of it, always. And on a sobering note, what Wole Soyinka says about what happened in Niger Delta in those days, and may those days end, and may those days never return. I find no poetry in slaughter fields, no lyric grace, redemptive passion, no. Only that which came and went as others, the blaze of empires, salvation's ashes, the crunch of cinders in time's cul-de-sac. Bronwyn, Paul, Bennett, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Salil.
Thanks, Will.
Bye. Thank